All right, and we're live. Hello, everyone. We were originally scheduled to do a debate last week. However, that did have to be rescheduled due to inclement weather and a lot of problems going on in real life that we were having to deal with. But yeah.
Yeah,
So
we're just gonna apologize in advance for the fact that there haven't been streams for the last 3 weeks. But as Heretic said, and I don't think I could put it any better, we've had stuff that's happened that's made it so we can't. So, but we do have a lot of new content on the main channel that's coming out pretty soon here. So on the plus side, we're gonna be doing some stuff to make up for it.
hmm and we'll be able to do our return to our regularly scheduled program. So in the meantime, we're going to be doing a part 2 to the debate from 2 weeks ago. So Colton, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting your name.
Colton Maxwell
Taylor.
Anderson.
And Taylor, yes. Feel free to introduce yourselves.
So, I was in the first debate. I am one of the main writers at the Hoppean.org, and we also did our own stream response to the Road to Serfdom video essay series that Esso and Filthy did. So, I promised them that we'd do some debates, and here I am just trying to fulfill that promise I gave them.
Yeah, and I'm Taylor. I was in I think I was in the first two of those videos. I am also a writer for Hoppean.org. More involved in the background than writing these days. I've been pretty lazy on that front. But yeah, excited to be a part of this and get into the nitty-gritty of all this shit.
All right, sounds good.
All right. Well, neither Heretic or I really need to introduce ourselves, but do either of you guys have any opening statements that you'd like to read off?
I do, if you guys don't have anything. So, do you?
No.
Okay, so the reason why we decided I kind of approached you guys about the morality and epistemology topic is because we saw your video on anarchism and morality, and that's where we thought that we would have a more productive conversation, just because that's exactly where the conversation led to in the previous debate. So I just kind of wanted to go through some notes Taylor and I made while watching that video and talking about it, so that way you can see what we think about what your video is all about. So
Okay.
I got clarification from Filthy that prescriptive statements are an establishment for how something should be done or used. So that's going to help just define what you mean by when you say something is prescriptive.
Mm-hmm.
So you start off saying that actions are conclusions.
Yeah.
And so a conclusion is a part of an argument, but the mistake here is saying that actions are arguments, and not all action is argumentation. So I can go get a glass of water, and it's not really an argument on anything, really.
Sure it is. Sorry, did you want to continue?
Well, no, that was kind of like the only point I had on that. I was just going to keep on going through the rest of my notes.
All right, well, you want me to? I can address that point real quick.
Okay.
Well, with the glass of water example, you can apply this to just about any single kind of action anyone could ever possibly take. But for getting a glass of water, for example, it does necessarily suggest an argument that you can, or you have the physical ability to get a glass of water. that water is accessible for you to acquire, that you have a glass with which to put the water in it, that you have the ability to have the glass of water, and presumably the ability to use the glass of water. There's a whole lot of underlying assumptions that go into being able to engage in that action alone, let alone to be able to perform the action itself, that go into the actual act of getting a glass of water, that I do genuinely believe that there is, at least on some level, some equivalence between being able to perform an action and the argument of performing the action.
So to clarify,
Sorry.
I was just going to say that to clarify specifically the point that Heretic is attempting to establish with that particular argument that we've been established in the last part of the debate, is that what counts as an action or what counts as a conclusion has to be employed by has to be essentially a product of what means are being employed to result in what we're considering that thing to be. So it's not informative to just say we're arriving at this conclusion, but arriving at this conclusion through essentially interchangeable arguments, because at that point the arguments aren't really showing the conclusion to be true, and the problem that leads is that it's not exactly clear at that point what you're arguing, because your conclusion could mean anything since it could be informed by anything.
Yeah, and I think that's where a discrepancy is in our understanding of what an argument is in regards to action, because there are unlimited justifications for each action.
I don't disagree about that. That's the point that that's the point I've been trying to stress since long before the debate, is that this is a disagreement about epistemology, about what counts as a thing. It's not a disagreement about principle. Very, very few, if any, philosophies do have radically different principles than one another. And even if they do, they come basically to the same conclusions. That's what I meant by that in the last debate.
But it's... So what is the difference in epistemology then that leads you to think that arguments are actions are arguments?
Because in the context that Heretic is describing, when we're looking at the morality of an action, is Heretic there? Okay. But in the context that he's describing, the action is an outcome because the action is determined by what the outcome is determined by what informs this action, what we're considering this action to be, and the actors who are involved in the specific in the specific dilemma. So what informs that is going to determine our conclusion. So we should look at what relates to or what's relevant when informing one's actions. So by informing, I mean just what we're basing our understanding of the concept on.
So could I sum up what as Filthy was trying to say in saying that people employ means to achieve ends?
Ends are contingent on the means employed would be a properly understood version of that. And where we're disagreeing, though, and I've noted this even in the previous episode, is that Hoppeans and deontologists just in general operate around a fundamentally prescriptive set of ethics because and this disagreement stems in their from their logical philosophy.
So we were gonna get to that eventually, but I just want to try to understand what we took our actions or conclusions as, because arguments are not just free floating; they have to actually be made by someone.
You want to say something about that, Heretic, or?
I was just wondering. I didn't say anything because I thought you were going to be continuing onward. But yeah, I don't think it's going to be particularly controversial that arguments or any conclusions need to be articulated by someone, and the same would also be true with an action. That action needs to be taken by someone.
That's exactly why ethics is a social science, because what you're observing are trends in how moral agents act upon other moral agents. So, no, you're not going to find any disagreement here.
Right, but if an argument needs to be articulated, then not every action is an argument then. Because me getting a glass of water is not me articulating anything, because I'm not actually speaking or in any way communicating. I am literally just filling my glass with water.
Well, I never said that. I never said that action necessarily require articulation, because articulation is a very specific form of action.
Yeah, right. I don't think Heretic and I don't think that those things are mutually exclusive.
No, I could.
And from my understanding of what, I'm sorry, Colton, go ahead.
No, Taylor, you should go.
Okay, and from my understanding, you guys are employing the idea that each action has an argument to base it on. Is what, from what I'm hearing with your justifications of saying that action is argument.
What were you going to say, Eric?
Mostly in Filthy's explanation of action as argument was that every action has a basis in argument towards its ends. That was my understanding of what he was saying, which is, I think, a big point of disagreement in where we're actually coming from. And and a clarification on that, which you've already done to a point, would be valuable here.
Well, what I was suggesting, I would have to go back and watch Heretic's video again, but I don't think he ever argued that point. But what I was suggesting, because this is just sort of the fundamental Aristotelian approach to ethics. What I was arguing is not necessarily that actions need to convey necessarily in the mind of the person conveying it some sort of communicative meaning, and there's an obvious problem right off the bat, and this is that information in a Platonic sense that could be universally communicated without context doesn't exist. But yeah, I don't necessarily think that that's an accurate characterization of the position that Heretic was putting forward. Heretic's point in talking about means and ends consistency when it comes to talking about ethical philosophy and why ethical philosophy is distinct from making claims about morality, it is just this point, essentially. It's not that you have to sort of consciously think this thing, and that is going to necessarily inform that's necessarily going to lead to what you do, because people interpret information in a whole host of radical, not necessarily logically consistent ways. But you can look at things that would inform their incentives, such as barriers to entry being created by the state, and then you can ask whether or not that's justified, whether or not those barriers to entry should be there, and you can ask, well, would this incentive exist had those barriers to entry been alleviated?
Okay, yeah, and I just want to clarify that I wasn't really referring to the video there. I was referring to Filthy's explanation at the beginning of this chat. That just the way that I took it, not in the way of the video that we did watch a couple days ago. That's just the way that he explained it sounded that way. I just wanted to clarify.
That's fine.
Everything makes sense.
But did you have any more to go on with Colton, or sorry for getting into conversations, I guess, based on your opening statement? Wait, are you talking and we can't hear you because your icon
I think he's talking.
I have not talked in a while.
Oh, there. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, well, your icon was lighting up as though you were talking, and yeah, that threw me off for a second. But yeah, did you want to continue, or?
I don't know, Taylor. I mean, I don't think we're really getting anywhere here.
I was just trying to clarify the position, simply because, like I said, I think there's a fundamental disagreement on how an argument informs an action and whether an action is an argument itself. And I think that a clarification on both of our positions might be valuable there. And whenever it comes to the ethics and morality argument, that's also something that I think that we disagree on, because it seems like you guys view ethics as a like, I don't want to say value free, such as like a praxeological like formatting of argument, but the disconnect between morality and ethics seems to be something we disagree on also. So a discussion on that might be valuable for sure.
Well, that was the whole point of the video that you originally brought up, which is the anarchism and morality video, which is just to clarify our own position on what morality necessarily entails and how it's differentiated from ethics, which, for those of you in our audience who have not seen that video, I basically just articulated that morality is separate from ethics. However, it is, of course, informed by it, insofar as morality is just behavioral preferences of individuals and of those that the individual seeks to associate with, which would form a culture. This differentiated from ethics insofar as they do not make any claims as to what behaviors are or are not justified, or what behaviors can or cannot be justified.
If you, I guess, in a Wittgensteinian sense, if it would help for me to try and sort of paint this mental picture, Heretic and I don't, when we're because I used to be a deontologist, I think because I remember sort of picturing ethical dilemmas in the same way. I think that the problem is that when deontologists are talking about ethical dilemmas, in the same way that I guess going back to the comparison between virtue ethics and praxeology, I think that the problem that's happening here is you're using these sort of models that are supposed to demonstrate principles and treating them as though they're prescriptions onto reality. So if we're talking about just sort of a basic scenario where somebody is being mugged by a mugger, that's however you would argue that's wrong or what should be done about that is sort of from the deontologist perspective, just what should be done. Whereas whereas virtue ethicists are looking at ethical consistency as a sort of condition in society that's achieved by getting rid of organizations like the state or political partners of the state, which make it so people have unequal claims over themselves and their ability to access resources.
So
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Colton.
well, I was kind of bring this down to an example from the video because I think that would help clarify what exactly filthy means.
Sure, what's up?
Right.
So, so you say that murder, rape, kidnapping, and theft are conclusions, and then you say that the conclusion is it's a claim to dominion over others, which cannot be logically defended conceptually.
Mm-hmm.
But would you actually should I put this? So that's your ethical claim for murder, rape, kidnapping, and theft. But would you actually say that it is a moral claim as well? Because that seems pretty much that you're saying that it is unjustified, and if it's unjustified, it would seem that you would be saying that it has to be immoral.
I suppose.
And for me too, and I'm sorry. Yeah, just let me go further on that just for a second.
Sure.
And it seems as if now I don't know if you guys are NAP adherents, non-aggression principle adherents anymore. I honestly haven't paid attention to you guys for a while. No insult. It's just like I'm not really in these spheres. But the NAP is a moral principle applied to ethics. And if you apply the principle of non-aggression to the existence of the state, then you are applying your moral beliefs to an ethical principle that is prescriptive on the existence of an institution. And like just piggybacking on what Colton said, and now that's a lot more, and that's a way bigger argument. But again, that I think is where we're having a serious divide on the ideas of morality and ethics.
Well, Heretic and I are both. Okay, sorry. You go ahead.
Yeah, I was meaning to address this. So, let me see here. Sorry, you kind of went on a bit here. Just need a moment to collect my thoughts.
Yeah, that was a lot. My bad.
Fine.
Yeah. So the point that Colton brought up, and that is that you can simultaneously be making moral arguments and ethical claims. Is that a good way? Is that a fair characterization?
Well, it seems like if you think that something is logically indefensible, then you would have to say that it is immoral.
But
All right. So just sorry, SO, but just to
yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I bring up morality specifically as behavioral preferences. And so necessarily what that would have to mean is that one could have a behavioral preference, a behavioral preference against unethical behavior, which I don't think very many people would, least of all myself, would have much of a problem with. Yes, I do have a preference against people murdering, raping, kidnapping, otherwise just aggressing against me. That is completely true, and I don't think that anyone would find that to be either an inconsistency or anything that would resemble mutually exclusive. However, that's also to say that people can have preferences that are not against acts of aggression. They're not wrong for doing so because, again, morality is fundamentally just another preference. However, whether or not they have that preference at all is ultimately just going to be a value judgment that the individual is themselves that they themselves are going to make. But I think you also brought up a more important issue in regards to the non-aggression principle and whether or not one is able to apply their behavioral preferences onto a larger society or onto a larger institution, which is to say, how do you know that, or what is it that informs you to be able to know that your particular set of preferences happen to be correct? How are you justified in enforcing your own personal ideas for how people ought to behave? How do you know you're correct? How do you know you're any more correct than the state is for enforcing their particular set of preferences?
Well, and this is sort of what I was going to. The position that I was going to get into was in response to the first point that you established there. Well, the point of contention that we are having is whether or not ethical principles are informed by moral statements, or whether or not ethical truths end up how consistently an ethical truth an ethical condition is present in society informs culture and morality, which is our position. And so to start off an argument against that with the NAP, by defining the NAP as a moral argument is question begging. But let me explain why exactly, like what the problems are with trying to treat ethical principles as though they prescribe certain views and behaviors. Well, first of all, there's the problem that I mentioned earlier, where this view assumes that there is a sort of universal there's a universally communicable way of conveying information without any sort of context to other people. This is actually sort of the basis of how Kant came to the conclusion of his theory of I forgot what he called it, but he referred to the argument that I'm referencing here specifically as the universalization principle. And that's sort of the first problem there. But I guess I could go over, there are two other major issues. Well, the second major issue is that if ethics inform how people are intended to inform how people behave, or how they like what their attitudes are, well, then this would mean that ethical principles don't have any sort of basis for determining whether or not they're true, and thus it's essentially a relativistic statement. Because in order for it to be a principle, you need to be able to sort of demonstrate why it's true. If we're looking at morality as though these principles are just these principles inform morality, well, we can't do that, because in order for ethical principles to be informative, we need to know how exactly ethical principles we need to know why exactly moral agents associating in a certain way, the way that this certain principle references, is justified or not. And there wouldn't really be a basis for that on this point. The other problem that this creates is it means that rights are contingent and not absolute. Because if morality was determined by ethics, it would mean essentially that whether or not you have rights is contingent on a specific ideological belief. And thus, people who don't share that ideological belief are people that somehow don't possess agency. That would be a logically inconsistent ethical principle.
Well, that would actually go against universalization, that all ethical claims have to be universal, apply to everyone.
Yeah, it's a self-contradicting conclusion, but that's the logic, but that's sort of where that line of reasoning leads.
Well,
So I agree. That's just another argument against it, though.
well, the thing is that justification for action and morality are intrinsically linked, because if you cannot justifiably do something, then it is immoral for you to do it. It follows as the night does the day.
Can you explain?
Easy. So for instance, you say the state is unjust, and you say this because the very basis of the state cannot the state is at war with its people, and this is an ethical claim in I guess in the so it's the very statement that the state is unjust and it can't be justified is going to be a moral claim, because you're going to have to say, well, it is a moral claim in its own right. It's saying that you can't have there is no justification of a state, and therefore anyone that is using a state to do X, Y, or Z is itself indefensible. And if it's indefensible, then how are you going to justify it being moral?
Well, it doesn't necessarily carry a moral connotation. For instance, to say that it's unjustified to propose a principle which is self-contradicting. That's a statement that you can make without morality, and that's kind of where ethics finds itself into. What determines an ethical principle is basically just whether or not people count as moral agents, what people count as moral agents, why and how. That makes the question of ethics necessary, because then when moral agents are acting upon one another, those are actions that they consciously control, and thus there is a burden of proof dynamic there, and the burden of proof falls on them since they're the active party. That's what informs our understanding of why ethics is a justified concept. It doesn't require morality at all.
Morality is something that's entirely separate from the discussion of ethics, and I've touched upon it previously. The two do overlap, of course they do. However, when in regards to the subject of ethics and whether or not, just as one example, whether or not the state is justified, it fundamentally has nothing to do with any preferences for people's behavior that I may or may not have, or any one person may or may not have. It has everything to do with whether or not the actions that the state engages in can be ever referred to as knowledge. Because if it is or is not knowledge, it's going to be entirely dependent on whether or not it's going to achieve anything that resembles desirable ends or means.
So I wanted to go back to the contradictory statement idea. A contradictory statement is neither justified nor unjustified. You can make nonsense all day, and it is essentially not even while you can't justify anything with it. It is itself. It makes no sense to say a non-contradictory statement is unjustified or justified.
Well, I was speaking purely from the perspective of creating a logical model or trying to understand the principle. Yeah, of course, people could just make an incoherent statement, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, other than it's logically incoherent. But that presupposes that we're talking about prescriptive ethical positions again. I'm not trying to say that someone's actions are prescribed by some external principle. That's the position I'm arguing against. I'm arguing in this context that we can point to it being incoherent for someone to argue this position, not that they're arguing this position as in carrying out this act, but that the position they're putting forward is incoherent.
And this is why I brought up the question of knowledge earlier. Yeah, people can make up all sorts of abject nonsense as much as they want, not accusing anyone here of doing that, of course. But if they're just randomly doing things without any regards to conformity to knowledge, logic, reason, facts, or evidence, then anything that they're doing, points they're making are going to be fundamentally disconnected from knowledge, and as such, any results that they achieve, any conclusions that they make that are actually factual, are largely just a result of a shot in the dark. They don't know how they got there. It was just randomly achieved. And that's the best you can possibly hope for. The broken clock is right twice a day situation, because you're really just randomly stumbling about in the dark without any knowledge as to where you're going or how you're going to achieve that. You have fundamentally a disconnect between your ends and your means that is 99.9% of the time going to result in, well, something different than what it is you're originally hoping to achieve.
Here's something I wanted to bring this up actually again because Taylor, I believe, mentioned this earlier. Taylor, I believe, as in I believe it was Taylor, not I believe he mentioned this earlier. But anyway, it actually would probably be a great comparison to compare virtue ethics to praxeology. Because virtue ethics treats ethical study in the same way that praxeology treats the study of specifically economic action. But here's the question that raises. Considering that we would be using the same method of analysis according to the principle of concordance, which I mentioned in the last stream, but as a refresher, is a principle within the conceptual area of logic, where if you're using a single methodology to compare to study comparable areas of interest where the same logical principles for what inform them should be consistent, like economics to psychology, for instance, because you're studying people and what informs how people act. You should have the exact same lens of analysis. So why, since presumably we've established that ethics has to be a social study, because you're studying how people actually act with one another, why are we treating this as a prescriptive science when we're treating economics through the lens of how virtue ethicists look at ethics? That's an inconsistency.
Okay, and one thing that I would want to try and get an explanation out of you guys for is, how do you connect virtue ethics to praxeology? Because I would like to at least hear some form of explanation on it, maybe a synthesis. I apologize.
I'm not suggesting that. Sorry, I thought you were done.
No, you're good. It just sounds like you guys are trying to make a hybrid of two things that might be not opposed, but at least differentiated from each other. And that's something that I would also like to get an explanation of, not being somebody who watches your guys' channel frequently. But it is a point that I feel is very important, because you guys are not proclaimed, deontologists. You guys are something else.
Aristotelians.
Okay. That's fine. I would just like to hear where you guys see points of contention between praxeology and virtue ethics, or wherever you guys see points of agreement on those methods of inquiry.
Okay, well, in regards to the comparison between praxeology and virtue ethics, what I meant was that the lens of analysis through which both of them attempt to approach the study that they're approaching is the exact same lens of analysis. They both argue, well, these subjects are social studies, and make the exact same observations with the problems of trying to treat them as though principles in that subject are prescriptive. In social sciences, that's not coherent, because in order for conclusions to emerge, people need to act, and will goes into action, and that's not something that's even logically coherent, as we kind of touched upon earlier. So they use the same lens of analysis, and my point was simply, well, if you're going to use this lens of analysis for praxeology, well, given that the other subject is exactly you should essentially use the exact same lens of analysis, because it is a comparable subject. But I guess I'd like to know more what you meant in regards to explaining the differences in our thought. Because yes, we are coming from two entirely different logical schools of thought, and I've been trying to that's the point I've been trying to stress for the longest time, and I'm glad that we're finally getting there. But like, what specific subjects would you like to go over? Because we can in the current context of the debate, we can only really go over broadly what ethics is, but I guess we could talk about concepts within ethics, which is what I assume you're interested in, like property, for instance.
Property is really important to this type of debate. I'm glad you brought that up because I honestly was distracted by the other types of arguments that you guys could have made. I was trying to is that we might have points of disagreements because we do come from at least a similar side of liberty-ended argumentation, but have very distinct differences in philosophies. One, I was going to ask where. I'm not sure. And that's really where I'm coming from.
You can get back to this.
Oh yeah, for sure. And what I really wanted to discuss was the differences between, let's say, deontological or let's say deductive ethics, let's say argumentation ethics, purely praxeological value-free judgments on the nature of, let's say, non-aggression, let's say the nature of arguing against the state, versus your guys' type of argumentation as to the immoral nature of the state without coming from the same philosophical roots as, say, a Hoppean would, which is mainly Kantian or Misesian in that regard.
By the way, the concept within Kantian ethics I was referring to, that I was blanking on the name of earlier, was the categorical imperative. I don't know why.
Categorical imperative. Yeah, I was trying to think of the same thing. But like Kant's concept of the synthetic a priori, or the nature of knowledge that is not observable, is something that I think we might have a disagreement on also. Now that's, a little bit of,
well, that's
that might be a very important distinction, but also something that might take us 4 hours to fucking discuss.
it's actually really simple. That's a position specifically within inductive logic, and where where Aristotelians would disagree is that implies that there's a Platonic nature to whatever subject we're talking about that's just sort of intangible, but that debate serves to kind of slowly reveal the nature of, or more and more of it.
So what do you mean by induction?
I'm referring specifically to the school of logical thought, inductive logic.
Okay, because
it's a type of Platonic logic, and it works sort of in the way that I described it. And a lot of people unwittingly use it to inform their understanding of what they're considering their principles to be, because even though it's not strictly logical, it's sort of the default setting for how people interact with their environment.
Okay, but
so you're not referring to positive. I'm sorry. Let's go ahead, Colton.
So Kantian logic and the Misesian adaptation of Kantian logic to is not induction at all. It's deductive. It's pure deduction. It's starting from axioms, and it is taking those axioms and creating an argument and for it.
Right, but it presumes the existence of a sort of Platonic state in which the subject is perfectly represented, and the problem here is that the nature of the subject is informed by sort of studying what it is, what makes it up, and how it functions, and making such an assumption from both Heretic and I's perspective is essentially tantamount to being pseudoscientific.
That's
okay.
Go ahead.
What I'm just trying to what I'm hashing out here is that it seems like you guys think that the basis of knowledge itself seems to be inductive, no matter what school, whether it claims to be deductive or not. The nature of inquiring knowledge about the nature of man would have to include some type of inductive, let it be assumptions to a point.
Oh, it's actually that's the exact opposite. You can't just make uninformed assumptions about the nature of a thing, because the entire point of claiming that you're observing a thing is having the ability to point to things that sort of make that up, that are its properties, that entail it.
You can just simply start with the observation that I am observing this, which probably requires any presuppositions at all.
So this is why the rest of Kant's philosophy is important, because the transcendental arguments is a way of creating a synthetic a priori, as Mises puts it, or in other words, creating a priori knowledge that you don't need any type of observation in order to know, because you, in the transcendental argument, you show that the axiom itself is unrefutable, and because any other possibility is itself a contradiction.
Which also, leads itself to the nature of argumentation ethics, which is something that we also disagree on 100%. I definitely know that.
Right. I was silent because I thought Heretic had something to say about that, because we were actually talking about the transcendental argument earlier. But on that note, just really quick, can I get up and go get a drink of water?
Yeah, sure.
I'm really thirsty right now, and I've been begging for an opportunity to do that. Be right back.
All right.
You're good, bro. I'll crack another beer.
All right. So I think I can just go ahead and address the problem I have with the idea of the transcendental argument. And that is
Go for
once again, you're creating another inconsistency with means and ends. Just simply trying to state that the conclusion the conclusion is somehow able to override a faulty premise. I'm not sure I understand how that could possibly come about. How that could
So the
ever come.
the,
How that
the
could
argument
ever
is
manifest.
the argument is not that the argument is not that the axiom is faulty. The argument is that the axiom is unrefutable because any other possibility for what the axiom is saying is itself a contradiction, and therefore no other possibility other than the axiom remains.
Well, only if you assume that only the negation, or only the axiom, or the axiom's negation are the only possibilities, when in fact they could also both be true or both be false. There are multiple ways to approach approach a transcendental argument. Just to narrow it according to a singular binary is fundamentally going to limit the possibility of argumentation. So within its own framework, yeah, you're absolutely correct. However, that still doesn't disprove that does not disprove the necessity of means and ends consistency, which is fundamentally the problem with the problem that the transcendental argument has.
All right.
So you're misunderstanding. You're thinking that this is some type of dialectic. I am saying that either the axiom is true or some other possibility is true. And by showing that no other possibility can be true, we must say that the axiom is true. And so this is not a binary. Either this is true or something else is true. This is any other possibility. Which
that's and that's perfectly legitimate, but here's where Aristotelians and Platonists would disagree. Here's where we're disagreeing. What we're arguing is that you can't say that you actually even the concept that you even have an axiom in the first place, or that the information that you're using to assume that you're arguing the nature of a thing. The notion that that's even the case is in dispute until you've demonstrated that this is necessarily true. Even if you could sort of gather some bits of information using sensory information, which is also not legitimate, but I'll give a very basic example and say, I don't know, water. Water is something, a lot of its properties can be conveyed through sensory observation, but then there's the factor of how you contextualize that information. And also there are other properties that are not revealed with simply sensing it. For example, what the nature of hydrogen is, and how it interacts with other chemicals in the periodic table.
So
ionization.
Taylor, do you have anything to say?
That's just broadly the problem with the transcendental the transcendental position is that the transcendental position. Sorry, I misspoke for a second there. Basically assumes that argumentative frameworks have properties, but it's not really necessary to demonstrate these properties. Or you can use an incomplete understanding of something to draw conclusions from this principle. And until you have demonstrated the nature of that principle, I think it's really inappropriate to say that you've drawn any conclusions from it, because you have a shaky foundation for what counts as that principle.
So are you saying that you can't talk about a certain property of a concept until you have, not even of a concept, of even an object or anything you're thinking about, until you have proven all the properties of that object?
Well, standards of observation are different depending on the subject.
I'm not even talking about observation.
To say that you've observed something, it depends entirely on the subject what counts as a standard of proof. So that's kind of a weird question to begin with.
Well, I asked that because it seemed like that's where you were going, and so I wanted a clarification.
Okay.
And so I'm not really even talking about an observation as Kantian logic, and especially Mises's adaptation of it in order to study social science, which he calls praxeology. It doesn't really even require any type of observation. In fact, Mises argues that you must first do praxeology and make these transcendental arguments before you can do observational analysis, because you need some way in order to contextualize the observations in order to create data in the first place.
Mises didn't argue that Platonic properties needed to exist in order to observe economic action. What he argued is that you needed an ability to demonstrate the context. Essentially, you need to be able to demonstrate the need for what units you're using, what you're counting as an economy, or what you're counting as an action, and so on. And that's not inconsistent with the Aristotelian perspective. In fact, it bolsters it, this is actually something I was about to bring up earlier. That I think to characterize Mises as a Kantian necessarily a Kantian is a bit of a stretch. His work can be interpreted as confirming a bunch of different philosophical, meta-ethical positions.
Well, that's how Mises himself described it in epistemological problems in economics. So I'm just using what he said it was. And
yeah, I would say that it's. Go ahead, Colton.
I need a definition of what you mean by Platonic properties. If you think that somehow Mises does not somehow violate the Platonic properties principle.
Okay, well, first of all,
Hoppe does.
I thought you were done.
No, just define Platonic properties for me.
Well, no, you weren't. You weren't done with what you were saying. What were you
about
to say?
Well, I initially thought you were going to attack all of praxeology and all of deductive reasoning, because
I'm a Rothbardian, dude. Why would you think that?
Because of what you had argued about Platonic principles and being Aristotelian. So, but then you said that Mises does not violate whatever it is about Platonic properties, and so, but somehow Hoppe does. So I need somehow the transcendental argument does. So I kind of need a definition of what Platonic properties are.
First of all, I never said that Mises's epistemic beliefs outside of economic study, at least, were logically consistent. We were just talking about praxeology. And this is also something that we covered in the last episode of the debate, where you can reference a concept or a principle within that sort of that area of study. You can claim that that's the conclusion that you've come to, one which supports this position, but you can make an argument which does not logically lead to this position. I'll give you an example of this outside of the context of Mises and Hoppe. Kevin Carson, for example, somebody that Heretic and I are fond of, but presumably you think is airlifted shark food. He argues that he considers himself to be a consequentialist, and he considers the position that he's promoting to be a consequentialist position. However, it's very clear if you read any of his arguments on the concept of property, that's not actually the position that he's promoting, because he very clearly does believe that there is a property right that exists beyond just how people act upon resources. And with him, I can tell you exactly where he's getting confused. He's trying to argue the virtue ethicist position, but he doesn't fully understand the concept of means informing ends, and comes to this weird conclusion. And I guess Hoppe's version of this would be arguing that there exists the problem with arguing that there exists something, say, like a culture outside of a society, or customs that exist outside of the presence of a society, is that a society can only exist, or properties of a society can only exist if there are already people associating in order to create one. Hoppe's arguments frame culture and social customs as though they're something which can be engineered by a sort of central organization, not necessarily a coercive one, but that's just his portrayal of what a society is. And the problem here is that if this is his understanding of what informs a society or customs of society, well, then that runs into conflict with a whole host of libertarian principles or justifications for libertarian conclusions. One of which that we've been talking about pretty prominently, or the one that's sparked the most attention, is the concept of property. This view is going to necessarily lead to property claims needing to rest on some sort of unilateral standard of contract, because this means, as we were talking about earlier, that law, quote unquote, exists outside of society and social customs. That's the case if ethical principles prescribe morality and behavior. And the problem, though, is that this makes rights arbitrary and contingent on the existence of a sort of central organization. And the existence of natural rights existing just because moral agents exist is the basis that libertarianism uses to criticize the state as a unjustifiable institution. The state acts outside of the standard of justification. The standard of justification could never apply to the state, because the state, by default, is in a position where it just has a greater claim over everything. Therefore, the state is illegitimate. So Hoppe argues that his views lead to this conclusion, but they can't, because in order to argue these views, that has to run into conflict with one of the entailments of how libertarians come to understand that the state is illegitimate, or that political authority is illegitimate. So what he claims to be arguing an anti-state position. I've never denied that. What we're arguing is essentially that these aren't really anti-state positions, or at the very least that Hoppe has very shaky epistemological views, or attempts to draw connections that he hasn't really worked out completely.
Taylor, I know you've got something to say to this.
I'm just trying to work it out for a second. I missed a little bit of that. I had some outside interference.
Do you mind if I sum it up real quick?
Go ahead, please. Actually,
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So the basic idea is that when you assume that rights and just ethics in general are prescriptive, then it becomes dependent on a centralized authority with which to impose rights onto society, for lack of a better term. The problem is that if you assume that it's something that needs to be imposed on a society, then it becomes necessary for that centralized authority to exist for rights to exist in the first place. The trouble is that if you make that assumption, then it becomes impossible to refute the state's existence in the first place because the state is trying to position itself as the very authority from which rights are derived from. So fundamentally, Hoppeanism cannot be an anti-state position while holding the position that rights are prescriptive.
okay. So, what I really need to clarify here is: do you believe that the idea of, or even the nature of argumentation ethics, meaning the nature of argumentation, which is inherently an anti-monopoly on force argument for anti-statism, is a top-down philosophy and requires the same belief on moral standards other than non-aggression? Now, that is something that we can definitely talk about, but like, it is almost to me, it is an irrefutable position based on the nature of self-ownership itself. Do you think that argumentation ethics itself violates the concept of self-ownership?
No.
I'm sorry. The last two sentences or last sentence are really the most important part of it. It takes a second for me to hash it out sometimes.
Arrive at. I just said you could arrive at a conclusion if your argument isn't logically consistent. That doesn't mean that it's not an attempt to support that conclusion. It just means that it's an inconsistent attempt that, logically speaking, can't arrive at that conclusion. And I mean, I suppose you could, that doesn't mean you don't see yourself as a libertarian. It just means it's not a libertarian argument, or it just means that the position you're proposing is not necessarily consistent with libertarianism.
Yeah.
Okay, and to clarify,
the position where we have is not that argumentation ethics is somehow incompatible with the idea of self-ownership, or somehow is accidentally a refutation of self-ownership. It's just that we don't see it as a valid way of reaching a conclusion of self-ownership.
Right. This is why Taylor, do you have anything to say?
No, you're good, Colton. You're probably better at this than me. At this point,
this is why I was going down the road of trying to figure out why they don't think transcendental arguments are convincing, because the argumentation ethics is itself a transcendental argument. So that's why I was trying to get down what a Platonic property is.
Yeah, I had explained. I'm sorry that I didn't go over that again, but I'd explained that earlier. A Platonic property.
I know.
It's a reference to the world of forms, but it takes shape in various different schools of logical thought.
I was actually going to ask Filthy if you could explain it, because you had already explained it. I still wasn't grasping it.
Okay.
What do you want me to explain?
The Platonic properties, and how essentially how first, just give me a definition of platonic property so I can actually understand what you mean by it,
All right.
and then also,
I-
also how go. Okay, I can ask the second question after you give me.
Yeah, please keep that second argument in mind because if you keep asking questions, chances are I'm gonna lose my train of thoughts. I don't mean to be rude, it's just that my way my mind works. But yeah, the platonic properties, just to go over it for the sake of our audience, references the world of forms, which is the belief that Plato had that objects that exist in reality are only understood by people because of our vague recollection of having observed them in this higher dimension that Plato believed in called the world of forms, where we only know that a chair exists because we saw the perfect form of a chair in the world of forms. And of course, he applied that to not only just objects that exist in reality, but also concepts like love, like fear, like terror, like light, that we only know about those things and can know of them in reality because they exist in their perfect form in reality, and that reality is fundamentally a less or an imperfect version of it. Now, in regards to these Platonic concepts, yeah, there's a whole lot of ethical philosophy. Kant is particularly bad at this, where he will make an argument that certain things exist in some kind of higher state, some higher perfect realm, where they just exist largely disconnected from reality. So, did what I say make sense?
I mean, it makes sense, but would you not say that a theory has to be in some way a idealization of whatever you're trying to study, and that any particular example that would apply this theory would have would not just be a a one-to-one comparison to that theory?
No, because the point of the study is to try to understand the nature of the subject. If you walk into study with essentially the presumption that you already have part of the study understood and apply that to your arguments, or apply that to what you're considering to be a standard of proof, that's pseudoscience. Because because the conclusion that you're coming to is not actually being demonstrated through observation. It's in part just presupposition.
So I have a question then. Do you think that the only type of knowledge that you can arrive at is through observation?
Depends on what we're considering observation. I'm just talking about noting that things exist generally. What do you mean? Because
I was talking about a theory on how a specific thing works. So, for instance, the Austrian business cycle states that when new money is created and it is inserted into the market, it will drive where it is inserted into the market, it will start driving prices up. And as the new money circulates throughout the economy, this ever increasing bubble of newly inflated money will start causing prices to go up in further and further parts of the economy until the entire economy is affected. This affects the business cycle because business plans have already been put in place on previous prices, and the new prices that are increased can cause businesses to go under because they are no longer profitable. Now, if you try to apply this theory to any particular instance, you're going to see that there are other factors that go into how prices form, and so you're not going to see this one-to-one comparison of newly minted money goes into this sector of the economy and the prices go up, because there are other factors that could arise.
Oh, so you're talking about sensory observation and data models? No, I'm not arguing that necessarily. I'm not arguing.
No. So
I'm not an empiricist, so no, I don't argue that.
okay, because
Yeah, essentially what I think we were talking about is observable knowledge versus knowledge that be acquired through other means,
In fact, I have the
aka
same,
the Kantian method, aka praxeology.
in fact, I
Yeah.
have the same.
Observation is entirely different than inquiry.
In fact, I have.
Well, at least is another method of inquiry.
I have the same problems with empiricism as I do as I've expressed here with deontology. It's essentially an entire school of methods of analysis which just assume that there is context inherent in sensation, and I think that's delusional and disconnected from reality. Just to clarify specifically why I'm not an empiricist, but
well, no, that's fine. I just based on you just keep on going back to observations and
no,
you-
I'm referring to I'm referring to observation in a I guess academic context where it just refers to or I'm assuming that that everybody here understands that what we're actually disputing is not our principles, but what leads to those principles. I was so that's why I was using the term observation to refer to various different types of study. But just to clear that up, because that doesn't really have to do with like necessary logic. That's just I guess something I chose to do because I thought everybody had the same context in a certain regard.
okay. So now that we understand what a Platonic property is, how do you think that a transcendental argument actually violates some sort of is essentially contradictory?
I didn't say that it's I didn't say that it's contradictory. What I said is that it's not able to reach the conclusion that it claims to. That could be because it's inconsistent, or it could simply be that it reaches a different conclusion. The means that are being suggested those ends don't follow the means being employed.
But I'm fairly certain that about 20 minutes earlier, you two essentially argued that transcendental arguments are invalid in terms of.
Well, they're invalid because they attempt to come to a conclusion, or they promote a conclusion that they haven't necessarily demonstrated to be true. So yes, they are invalid as an epistemological standpoint, because the conclusion, what they're claiming to observe, is not naturally demonstrated from the argument being put forward to support the subject in question's existence.
But that doesn't make any sense in terms of disproving transcendental arguments, because they are themselves just purely deductive arguments, unless you're going to say that you deny the possibility of valid deductive arguments.
No, what I'm saying is that what you're using to inform your principles has to be logically demonstrated and shown to be necessarily true.
If you haven't,
And that's the problem with that's the problem with transcendental arguments, is transcendental arguments don't do this. Transcendental arguments just put forward the notion that, hey, something exists here. We assume that this is a property of it, and therefore let's try to let's try to look at other observations and see how they conform to this property that we obviously already know is true, and that's how we find things, and that is completely backwards.
What you end up with is a standard. What you end up with is something that can scarcely be called knowledge, since without proof, there's no way of being able to evaluate if it's any more true or false than any other competing claim in a similar subject.
That's the problem with it. It turns every single quote-unquote argument into what is essentially a description. Every description can lead to the same conclusion, but you can't really... If someone's going to characterize something a certain way, there's nothing you could ever provide definitively to say that this is wrong. There's no way to check for consistency or to check for proof.
Well,
it's not a meaningful statement.
It seems like you're just confusing inductive arguments for purely deductive ones. Taylor, what do you think?
I'm honestly not sure. It seems like we have a real difference on methods of inquiry, especially when it comes to the Kantian ethic versus the Aristotelian ethic. I'm really just trying to hash out what necessarily we are trying to get to.
So,
but again,
the thing we're trying to get to is the reason why I keep on bringing up transcendental arguments is because almost all of praxeology is based on them. And so if you deny the possibility of a valid transcendental argument, you're basically denying praxeology as a whole.
Well, no, praxeology is based on deductive arguments, and there are a couple of different logical schools of thought which attempt to put forward deductive arguments, especially in the social sciences. That's not necessarily a property of transcendental argumentation. Aristotelians also take this approach.
Well, the issue you're going to have is that if you're going to deny the possibility of a valid transcendental argument, because it is a purely deductive argument, you're also going to have to say that either there are no such things as valid pure deductive arguments, or that you cannot prove an axiom to be true, which I don't think we have done.
Not necessarily. It could also be the possibility that transcendental arguments are simply an invalid form of deductive argument, assuming that they're even a form of deductive argumentation at all. Which, in all honesty, they seem more inductive to me.
So the definition of a transcendental argument is a purely deductive argument that proves an axiom. And so that's why I said you either have to say that pure deductive arguments are invalid or that the proof of an axiom is invalid.
But the definition of the transcendental argument that you gave, particularly in the previous debates, was clearly demonstrative of an inductive argument, which is just simply an argument that proves a presupposition to be true.
So that's why I think that you don't understand the difference between an inductive and a deductive argument, because what you just described there is a deductive argument.
And this is sort of what I was... the funny thing is that I was actually going to say, not necessarily... I wasn't going to necessarily make that point, but it seems like this entire line of questioning seems to be born out of not understanding the fundamental point that we're attempting to put forward, which is that ends are not the same thing as means, or distinguishing them. I know I've said that several times, but we've gone over the problem with transcendental arguments a couple of times, and we've sort of explained the problem. We've explained why it's not really possible to claim you've made an observation if in anywhere in your logical model you just assume that there is some sort of Platonic property that informs all of your methods of analysis. The problem here that I've come to essentially, it seems to be that you don't really understand. You don't really understand the difference between a conclusion and a method of analysis, and that's kind of important because that's sort of the entire. That's what informs our position. That's the reason we hold the position that we do. We are arguing that the method of analysis has to be justified by a sort of prior observation, and that needs to be justified through conceptual logic and having a consistent logical model.
So let's go back a few steps. So you were saying that essentially you can't have an idealized theory on how the world works, or a specific part of the world works.
Obviously you can, it's just not logic. It's just not it's not a scientific analysis.
But so what type of theory would you have? Would you have one that tries to account for every single possibility?
It's not something that accounts for every single possibility. It's something that looks at it's something that, based on your logical model, what epistemology you're arguing from, and demonstrating that this is the right logical model and this is the right epistemology, informs its method of analysis, its principles, and therefore its conclusions in a sort of I've likened it previously to creating a logical model in an Aristotelian sense. I've likened it to constructing a building. It's more like it's more like a web, where certain things can be tangentially related to one another, but we understand these things because we have this understanding of what counts as a thing, and this is informed by conceptual first principles.
This is why I brought up the Austrian business cycle earlier, because it is itself an idealized theory, and there are other factors that could arise. But let me go to the minimum wage. There are many empirical studies that seek to show that the minimum wage can actually mean that more employment happens. But that's because the classical argument against the minimum wage, which uses just classical economics, does not take into account everything that could possibly happen. But it seems like, because you disagree with the fact that there can be idealized theories, that you would even say that the supply and demand laws in economics are themselves suspect and invalid.
That's actually something that I don't know about Heretic, but I've been studying the work of Lockman lately, so I know that's I know that actually is a point of contention, not the principles of Austrian economics, but I'm a skeptic of things like cardinal utility and general equilibrium models for supply and demand. But it is 10:30, so do you want to get into that, or should we wrap up this episode?
I distinctly remember that Taylor was actually saying that you guys only had like 90 minutes.
Right, but I've been speaking for a while, so Taylor should probably say what he needs to say if we're going to be ending this.
Yeah, I don't necessarily agree that you can, as an Austrian, you can create models and demonstrate economic principles based on those models. That's kind of the point of Austrian. That's kind of the point of praxeology, is you can't do this because of so much of human social interaction is informed by things that are not knowable and incoherent to try to predict. For example, how people internalize information for themselves, or what information they internalize and how they try and apply it. So,
yeah, if we need a couple more minutes, I don't have a problem with it.
okay.
Obviously, but yeah, I mean, the idea that through a subjective method of inquiry or a subjective model doesn't have to at least come to conclusions is something I don't necessarily agree with. And I'm not even sure if that's something that you guys are even saying.
That's
But
my argument. My
I'm
argument.
sorry.
That's not my argument.
Okay, yeah, that's what I wanted to clarify.
Just what I'm arguing, though, is that what counts as a principle is studying. I'm arguing praxeology. What counts as a principle in economics is what incentive a person, understanding what incentives people might have, and understanding how people interact, and applying this to our understanding of resources and how they apply to this. So I'm not arguing fundamentally anything different. I'm just arguing that there are some. I'm arguing that there are some epistemological problems in that sort of general approach that you were taking. For instance, what justifies the scale of time that we're measuring? What justifies what we're considering to be an economy? Why are we studying these firms instead of these firms? That's a problem you run into with prescriptive modeling. As for why I'm a skeptic of general equilibrium models, general equilibrium models imply the presence of administrative pricing. So what my position on that is that supply and demand takes place internally within firms, and then firms try and coordinate around their own supply demand models within economies. That's how I'm. That's the basic. That's a TLDR of monetary kaleidics.
Okay, so are you guys you guys have read the Mike Hoffman book on monetary kaleidics? Is that kind of where you're coming from?
Yeah, and Lockman, more specifically,
Okay.
Lockman, who I would consider myself a follower of his type of Austrian econ.
Okay, yeah. Lockman's good. I'm actually in the process of reading it myself, so I can't really comment on the nature of that. Just because I don't want to.
Sorry, what were you saying?
No, that's fine. I just don't. I don't want to misrepresent any of their views, but that is helpful in understanding where you guys are coming from, for sure.
Yeah, we've been planning on putting out some content explaining that pretty soon here. But yeah, anybody who's curious, there's a book called Monetary Kaleidics by Michael J. Hoffman, and there are a couple books by that Ludwig Lockman wrote that you can find on Mises Institute's website. They're pretty great for at least I would argue looking at differing views on more nuanced aspects of the Austrian methodology, such as equilibrium theory or debates within equilibrium theory.
Yeah, and to be fair to them, like most people assume that the necessary Austrian viewpoint is Rothbardian, which they do go against quite a bit. So I mean that's something that should be discussed from us, and something that we could talk about for another 2 hours.
Sure, because my position is that they don't necessarily contradict one another. Even though
100% fair. But yeah, before we wrap up, the something that I don't want to switch gears to a point, but I think it's something that needs to be addressed. I don't know which one of you guys, either was Filthy or Iso, said that property itself was violence. The TLDR version. I wanted to bring that up simply because that was a Stirnerite justification of might versus right property.
no.
And and that is something that I definitely wanted to bring up because I have done a little bit of studying into the unique in its property, and the justification that Stirner has for property is that the only justification for it is that if you can defend it and you could properly hold it with in purely defensive means. So that's why I know you guys are like left libertarians and everything, which is perfectly compatible with the Stirnerite model. And again, I don't want to 100% switch gears before we end, but that was something that that really stuck out to me, and something that I have a certain understanding of. And I would like a clarification on that, and maybe we can talk about that for a little bit before this wraps up.
I'd love to, because I haven't really been online much, but I've heard that a lot of people are talking about that from other people in the anarcho house. But yeah, so in context, what we were talking about was sort of what counts as a right, or how do we understand what a right is? Like, what do we point to as a right? And what I'm saying is that there does not exist an intrinsic thing outside of human action that is just a right. A right is something that you defend. And the question of ethics, and therefore what counts as a right, is just a matter of what's justified in using force to defend, or what's in what sense are you justified in potentially using force. So when I'm saying that property is violence, what I mean is that there's no such thing outside of just people and their resources as property. So the proper way to understand a right is just a way of categorizing how people act, which is justifiable through ethical principles.
Okay, and I think wherever with us using argumentation ethics as a justification for absolute private property rights, and then you guys bringing up that property is only justified through violence itself. Now, we would both agree upon the ideal that
Did not say property is justified by violence. I said that property is defined by violence. What makes a resource property is you using violence to exclude other people from it.
Okay. Yeah. There is a distinction there, but still, that sounds to me like a at least a non-Rothbardian, non-Hoppean, at least justification for private property, and a pure.
I could link the specific essay in which Rothbard argues this position.
I would love to see it. Just simply because I haven't seen anything of the sort. But I have seen Max Stirner justify that sort of ideal of property with the only justified property is that which can be defined through the use of force and the ability to use force.
Well, we're not defending property on the basis that it can be defended, therefore it's justified.
Okay, that's just what it sounded like last time, and that was I only watched a little bit of the last debate. I'm not gonna pretend like I watched the whole thing and studied it extensively,
That's
but
fine. And
that was one thing that I did take away from it. That did sound particularly Sterneristic to me. Only because I have read Rothbard, I've read Hoppe, and I've also read enough of Stirner to understand what his justification of property was.
It's good that you brought that up, actually, because it gives us the opportunity to clarify what Esso meant when he said that. Which, as I'm sure you imagine, there's quite a bit of controversy in our community as well. People were asking what the hell he meant by that.
But yeah, as far as, because remember, I don't believe that there exists an anti-property position, or at least I think that is it's a very loaded way of characterizing competing claims about the nature of property. But no, this is actually a view that Rothbard changed. Like what he considered to be an entailment of throughout his career. He consistently considered himself to be a natural rights philosopher, but what informed his approach to natural rights changed, and throughout the 60s to early 70s, he was arguing this position, which is, long story short, the Aristotelian one.
Okay, and yeah, from my understanding of Rothbard's thinking on property, he went from the more Kantian, subjectivist Misesian theory of property to the Aristotelian natural rights theory, which is something that you guys said that Rothbard changed his thinking of, which you know, to a point I would necessarily agree with, but there is a point to wherever the change is necessarily important to his conclusions. It's hard for me to describe, but I do understand the change in Rothbard's thinking, but not the real conclusions of those justifications. If I could succinctly say that.
The fact that he joined and threw his full support, behind the Libertarian Party is an indication of one of the major weaknesses in Rothbard's thinking throughout his career, and that is he thought that you could come to he thought that it was legitimate to come to conclusions regardless of the means employed. He didn't see conclusions as though the means which explained them were necessary, were contingent. I think that's kind of strange because in his earlier work, even to some extent bleeding into like the mid 70s, you can find sections of For a New Liberty where he explains why it's not possible to make a libertarian case against the state without coherent rights philosophy.
You mean chapter 1?
Yeah. But you can but my point though is just that he demonstrated he explained this as though it's a position he understood, but if you look at his actions, he didn't seem to. So I guess this would be a good example of kind of what I was talking about, what we were talking about earlier. There's a difference between actions employed and what one claims to have rationalized, because process of rationalizing information is not necessarily logical. I was actually on another note. I'm sorry. I was actually gonna write an essay about this at some point. What associations Rothbard created each year sort of plotting out based on material he put out in that year, how his thinking was evolving, etc.
No, and assuredly his thinking did change. The idea that Rothbard didn't develop his ideals nor even change philosophical schools, I think, is mistaken. But his justifications were very, very close together. Whenever he was a pure Misesian in terms of, the Kantian subjectivist theory of property, it didn't really change his. Now, maybe his justifications might have minorly changed, but his ultimate goals didn't change in terms of what he felt that was the justified necessity of private property.
In other words, the conclusion didn't change. It was just
the conclusion didn't change, and maybe his arguments changed a little bit in terms of philosophical schools of justification. But I mean, also he, to be fair to your guy's side, he did say that after Hoppe came out with argumentation ethics, that this was something that was absolutely revolutionary and that it changed his thinking on the necessity of private property rights. But I am not sure that these things are a necessary. It is hard for me to say in terms of justifications for the conclusions in terms of a minor disagreements, but I mean, I guess that's what we're talking about at the moment. But I don't think Rothbard's thinking from the 50s to the 70s really goes against his thinking from the 70s to the 90s on the justifications of absolute private property rights. I think there are.
I was just going to say, in terms of the principles that or at least like the concepts that he references, the principles he claims to be promoting, I agree. I don't think that there was a change, but how he came to those, he definitely changed in terms of how he came to those conclusions, or how he rationalized those conclusions. And that's a sort of a major black mark on his career, in my opinion. If a lot of his conclusions do logically check out, but they check out. They have to be put into different contexts in order for them to be consistent. Rothbard, beyond the early 70s, very, I wouldn't say seldomly, I was going to, but I'll correct myself, because he was still a good philosopher beyond that point. He was still a pretty well-rounded philosopher, but gradually over time, he became more and more reliant on this stupid transcendental argument that led. Oh, did he disconnect or?
What?
Yeah, I have no idea, but yeah, I'm still here. I'm sure he'll be back, but yeah, I do agree with you that his thoughts did change to a point, but whenever his justifications went from the Misesian Kantian justification for absolute private property to the Aristotelian, back to the Kantian in terms of him accepting argumentation ethics as the pure justification of private property, are those distinctions that important, or did his thinking change that much? And you might say that
I don't think that is. Sorry, you continue.
I know you're good. I'm kind of hashing it out as I talk. But I don't know if those distinctions philosophically are even that much different, because I view argumentation ethics as a verification of the Aristotelian ethic through other means. And I think that's something that we might be able to have a discussion on. And honestly, the discussion of early Rothbard as a property rights thinker, especially in the era that he was writing Men, Economy, and State, For a New Liberty, Anatomy of the State, might not be as important as others imply. And that's something that that I've kind of stressed in the past. But I would like to hear your guys' thinking on exactly how those things are diametrically opposed to each other in terms of being accentuated by each other or complementary.
Well, the fatal flaw with argumentation ethics is the same at its root as the fatal flaw with the Kantian argument, because what justifies property and all of these other ethical concepts within libertarianism is entirely presuppositional. We don't really have a clear really have a clear understanding of the nature of, say, property. We have sort of a vague idea of what justifies it as a concept, but there are various different theories about what justifies property. We have no way of knowing which one is true if the only thing that justifies property is just some Platonic notion that property exists. And on top of that, because it's presuppositional, this means it exists outside of standards of verification. There's no way to ask what counts as a thing, why or how. As a result, that's going to, unless that is basically the part that's changed, there's no way to make AE compatible with any form of Aristotelian logic.
There's also various other problems I've observed with argumentation ethics as I've been trying to study it both for the essay we wrote and for the debate. One of the ones that I came across being that argumentation ethics can really only be useful in terms of being able to identify the self-ownership of the two participants involved in the discussion, which creates a whole lot of other problems when you realize that the argument that you and I have self-ownership and nobody else is an argument that is in no way contradictory according to argumentation ethics, and therefore, according to the universalization principle, must therefore be valid. And then, if two other people, like say 500 miles away, make that exact same argument, that argument must also be true according to the universalization principle, yet it comes into conflict with the very argument that I had articulated to you, which is to say, like, which one of us now has self-ownership? Naturally, argumentation ethics is ill-equipped to be able to resolve this, and it can only be resolved arbitrarily. It falls outside of the realm of knowledge.
And where I would disagree with you is that in that discourse, both of those individuals are exclaiming that they have some form of self-ownership, meaning that they own themselves, they are capable of argumentation, and anything to go against that standard would be a performative contradiction in the necessity of self-ownership.
Oh, no. I'm agreeing with you in that. All I'm saying is that if you and I are having this discussion as an example, I can make the argument that you and I own ourselves and nobody else. As in, I'm just saying that because we're participating in a discussion, you and I are literally the only people on Earth who have self-ownership. And that's all that our discourse is able to prove.
And that's kind of another major problem, though, is that because all you're able to prove, even internally, if we were to assume argumentation ethics to be valid, is just that these people have property rights. Well, that doesn't tell us what we can or can't claim. And argumentation ethics has no way of distinguishing between, say, unilateral or bilateral claims of ownership, and that's very important because that's the distinction between claiming I can have a right to land that you rightfully own because I exist, and I have a right to my body because I exist. But if you want an even more simplified explanation of this, within property rights, how I act and resources available exist in two separate categories. That's what Heretic and I refer to as claim rights and liberty rights. What you have a right to do, and like what in pursuing your own human action, your own self-interest, just in terms of how you behave, and what resources you would have a right to claim, or how you have a right to act with your resources. And Hoppians don't distinguish between those two arguments.
No, we we don't, and I think that's an important point, is because the means of exchange between two individuals is inherently linked to the links between all, and as praxeologists and individualists and libertarians who value individual rights, I don't think that we can separate the rights or the idea of argumentation and praxeological exchange of ideas between individuals as separate from the ideas of the collective inherently having those same rights to exchange.
So,
and that's where I think the idea of the performative contradiction, in terms of argumentation ethics being a purely praxeological, deductive justification of property rights, as the ultimate justification of property rights, as not used as a collective argument, as I could probably say that more succinctly, but also as an argument for everyone, as I would say.
Just to make sure I'm not misrepresenting your statement, because that your premise there was that all economic activity affects other economic activity. Is what you said in the beginning. So, are you suggesting that somebody planting a garden and then just picking and eating stuff out of that garden is affecting the ability for a farm in India to operate, because they're planting the same things? I'm not trying to be I'm not trying to pull in a reductio ad absurdum here. I legitimately, that's what I took away from what you said, and that didn't sound right to me. So I'm asking for clarification.
No, I mean, I 100% understand where you're coming from there. But whenever it comes to praxeological inquiry being a 100% individualistic method of inquiry, whenever it comes to the ethic of argumentation being between two individuals that acknowledge self-ownership, that I don't believe that I mean, this is tough for me for sure because I'm not at any right a expert on this subject. Stefan Kinsella is definitely one to look to whenever it comes to an expert on this form of inquiry. But whenever it comes to us being people who justify things on terms of individual ethics, the ethics of argumentation, meaning two individuals that are having a discourse and understanding the idea that we both own ourselves on those terms.
Do they though?
To
I mean, how do they understand self-ownership if their understanding of self-ownership is informed by the
because
fact that they're talking to other people?
Because they are not aggressing on each other on terms of actual physical force.
But how are they demonstrating that that's necessarily what self-ownership is, though?
Because if you are arguing with someone, if you are discussing with someone, even the most minute of details, you are acknowledging that you yourself own the ideas. Well, not the ideas, but you at least own yourself and your own person, and you are able to discourse with this other person on the fact that you might even have a disagreement.
But that doesn't. That's kind of my point, though, is that that's not. If that's you're presupposing though that everybody has a perfect understanding of self-ownership, and that's
I don't.
that's even how they're interpreting self-ownership. It's not proof. In order to make that realization, the person in question has to essentially already have an informed idea of what self-ownership is, in which case in which case that's not really persuasive. Those are just two people who agree with each other, jerking each other off.
No, I can agree with you there, but I don't believe that argumentation ethics implies a presupposition of people actually understanding the private property ethic. I think that argumentation. I'm sorry?
Papa himself has argued that it does, though.
Okay, I would honestly have to look into that, but it doesn't necessarily believe that two people understand everything about the private property ethic. It only acknowledges that you yourself have ownership of yourself and that you are able to have discourse with an individual and are able to understand the norms that are acknowledged by having that discourse.
But if you're looking to the norms of discourse to try to figure out whether or not people have self-ownership, then you end up with exactly the problem that we're trying to identify with you earlier, which is that, well, all you can really do is prove that the two people involved in the discussion have self-ownership, and only those two people.
You can't even really prove that. They just have some abstraction of what counts as self-ownership, but because it's presuppositional, there isn't any sort of inherent context that allows them to understand the concept of self-ownership. They just have this abstraction where self-ownership is when I act, and that's justified by self-ownership.
The argumentation ethics does really nothing to clarify what norm of property is just or unjust. So it's really difficult to understand what is meant by self-ownership when it is asserted that argumentation ethics demonstrates self-ownership. Not to mention like the problem that we've identified earlier in our essay numerous times in how argumentation ethics does not distinguish between claim rights or liberty rights.
Okay, and that is something that we can definitely discuss in the future. It looks like this has gone on for at least about 2 hours, and Colton bailed. So,
He didn't message
but yeah,
or anything, so I'm gonna hope that was a connection issue. But
He said before that he was gonna be doing this for like 90 minutes, and it's been 2 hours. So there's a very good chance, like, I don't know, maybe he had work in the morning and had to go to bed. In which case,
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's possible, and I would definitely like our next discussion to be simply on this issue, because we did hash out a lot of discrepancies we had on let's say Rothbard, or just individualist ethics in general, or property in general. But whenever it comes to the justification of private property rights vis-a-vis the ethics of argumentation, this is another discussion that we could definitely have. I really didn't. I'm going to be honest with you. I didn't really want to have to do another one of these, but it looks like we are going to have to. But and that's perfectly fine with me, because I think that there could be some value gained on this very, very big discrepancy, because I would like to clarify what your guys' position is on the justification for property rights, because like I said, with Filthy's uh justification, meaning property being violence, as said, now that might be a very TLDR version of your understanding of rights or understanding of property. That's fine, but we really do need to hash out what our differences are in terms of the justification for that property. Obviously, mine being argumentation, and yours being maybe the early Rothbardian, uh, hashing out our disagreements on early Rothbard also, or other philosophical schools on the justification for that property that we are arguing for.
that's gonna be really spicy, because then we're gonna that would allow us to start getting into like urban homesteading and and the cash nexus.
Okay, that's fine. If you guys, I mean, I guess we're wrapping this up now, and me being solo, I'd probably have to talk to Colton a little bit about it. But I think that the next discussion should earnestly just be on the concept of property itself and the justifications for it. And this was a good talk. I'm glad that I did it.
That was great. That's a concept that I actually wish people would debate about more, because I really don't think a lot of libertarians have a very fleshed out view of property. It's not
no, and I would agree with you. My first article for Hoppean.org was taking libertarianism back, because of just the idea of private property being the guiding ethic. And if we have some discrepancies on what that ethic is, I think that is something to be valued in terms of a real discussion. Because you guys have your audience, we have ours, but yeah, something that can actually be discussed without some bullshit Twitter, just paragraphs.
Yeah, I don't even use Twitter, because it is a gigantic waste of time from the perspective of someone that just wants to read material and wants to write essays that put forward, I think, a better understanding of a subject, or one that I would like to promote that I think is interesting, that I've come to.
I just find Twitter boring.
Yeah. I'm an advocate for sure. For certain reasons. I do okay on that site every once in a while, and my boy Bert Neocon Remover does pretty good through humor. Jared and Democracy does well. And just, with us promoting, it's fine. But whenever it comes to actual philosophical discussions, I think that there is something to be desired to a point. But yeah, I mean, if you guys want to do another one, I would be open to it.
Sure.
I wasn't at the beginning of this, but I think there is some value to be taken from this entire discussion. And if you guys want to do another one on just the nature of property itself, I would absolutely be down.
I enjoy having debates on the stream, and honestly, the intention behind the Backalley was to have more sort of live stream discussions than we've been having. And yeah, I would wholeheartedly, I especially the concept of property. Like if a lot of modern libertarians went back to read Benjamin Tucker's property argument against rent contracts, which, by the way, Heretic's position and my position is not that rent contracts are illegitimate or that there's something illegitimate about them, but Tucker's was. I don't think they would have. I don't think they'd know how to handle that position, and I think that that's kind of unfortunate because and this is sort of what I was alluding to earlier. To characterize a lot of these types of property ethic as anti-property it portrays their argument as though their argument is some weird sort of autistic argument against a certain type of claim, like that claim is illegitimate because reasons. But a lot of the early libertarian arguments against rent were based in property rights, and their argument specifically is that the reason it's prominent in society today is that barriers to entry created by the state and the state's land monopoly makes it so land is more scarce, and thus more people have to rent out. Which, by the way, that part of the argument Heretic and I are in agreement about. Then the ethical side of the argument is the interesting position that I don't think a lot of people understand, but it's important to have a more fleshed out view of property. And basically their criticism is against the idea of sticky property. They're making sort of the same mistake in a sense as Hoppeans and like more thin libertarians, I guess, if you want to call it that, where they think that because they can't point to a sense in which outside of just the resource existing in the person, a sense in which rent exists, then there's an ethical problem with the concept of rent. I think that's kind of weird and inconsistent, but yeah, we can get into that later.
Okay, yeah. Like I said, I obviously have my disagreements. But yeah, that I think the next one, and like I said, I actually did enjoy this discussion. I didn't think that I was going to that much, but it was something that gained some value from for sure. But I think the next one, just dealing with the concept of property, like I said earlier, whenever I said that Filthy's justification for property sounded almost Sternerite, and I don't want to strawman you guys whatsoever in terms of
that was actually my argument, to clarify. But did you agree with it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see anything wrong with it.
All right, you can describe.
Okay, yeah, and yeah, and it was something that stuck out with me in the last one. So I mean, if you guys want to do one more just on the concept of property and the justifications for property itself, I would be absolutely open to it, and would actually, I think, would be valuable for the people who watch. So, I mean, if you guys want to do it, I'm down.
I'm down.
Absolutely. I would love to.
All right. Well, this was a good discussion. I appreciate you guys for having us on. Hoppean.org. Just doing a little plug there. I know you guys aren't exactly lovers of the site. I don't know if you are or not, to be honest. But we have a lot of
we
people.
are, but ironically.
Okay, that's fine.
I can't point to any of the articles you've written, but some of the articles on that site, no offense, because it doesn't have to do with you, but I mean, I guess it has to do with your site. I like legitimately laughed out loud at a few of them.
Okay, that's fine. We can talk about that 100%. But yeah, that I like a lot of the guys who write for that, and a lot of people that are doing good work for it. And yeah, I mean, if you guys want to have another discussion, I'm honestly down. And I think we got some valuable things out of this discussion. And yeah, whenever you guys want to do it again, let us know. We'll do it.
Let's just keep the group chat open, and then we can do that.
Okay, sounds good.
Anyways, I'm just going to go ahead and wrap this up. So thank you, everyone, for stopping by, and we'll see you next time. Hopefully, we'll be able to resume our regularly scheduled live streams as well now that things are starting to get back to normal.